and see something from a culture perhaps before your own lifetime. And there's something really cool about that. And I think you really document that well in the series in addition to that.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Yeah, and that was one thing we were excited about is we actually went out and filmed vehicles. We used a lot of historical material, old TV commercials, old advertisements, old print photographs and stuff. But we also knew we wanted to go out and film these cars. You know, we couldn't film every AMC ever made, but we tried to get all the most important ones. And that doesn't always mean their favorite ones. Like, you know, everybody's favorite car, the Javelin, the AMX, the muscle cars. But like that also meant tracking down the AMCs that were like regular people cars, like a 4-door Rambler sedan, or one of the harder things to find was like an AMC Concorde, because that was just kind of a throwaway car you'd drive for 5 years, then sell as a used car, whatever, and people didn't save them. And so that was a cool part for me, was tracking down these vehicles, filming them so that we can see what did they look like, what did they sound like. You know, we tried to find them in stock condition or restored stock condition so that the viewer could see like, wow, this is really what people drove then.
From Olympic City and the home of Pikes Peak, this is the Automotive ADHD Show with Matt West.
Oh man, I have such a exciting show lined up for you today with a very special guest. I'm really looking forward to this, and maybe not for the reason that you think, especially if you have been following along with the show for the past couple of weeks. Now, coming up here in the next segment, I have documentary filmmaker Joe Ligo joining me, and if he sounds familiar, perhaps that's because you have already seen his documentary series on the history of American motors, The Last Independent Automaker. Maybe you've already seen that, or maybe you remember Joe from when he was last on this show about 2 years ago. He came on the show while he was in mid-production on the series to talk about it. And now we're coming full circle. We're following up with him. By the way, I've watched the series. It's amazing. I mean, it's really fantastic. You need to see this if you haven't. So he's going to join me in the next segment, and I think we're going to keep him for the entire program. So this is going to be a lot of fun. But the reason I say this is exciting, maybe not for the reason you were expecting, is because, like me, you were probably expecting that I would be in Tempe, Arizona right now doing this show live from Wesley Kagan's Speed Shop. And I was planning to be down there. But unfortunately, as I was getting ready to leave on Thursday, Wesley texted me. And unfortunately, he's had to make a difficult call. And I respect him for doing it, but he had to make a difficult call to postpone the whole live stream event. So I was going down there. We were going to do this show from there Saturday, and then Sunday we were going to do a 12-hour marathon live stream, LS swapping his Bentley, which, if you've been following along, is the most expensive production car in the world from 1993. Anyway, so unfortunately, because of a couple of factors, it's never just one thing, but Wesley's been having issues with his mill this week, and he's been needing that to make parts for this swap, because you don't just buy off-the-shelf LS swap parts for a Bentley, by the way. I hate to break that to you. You just don't do that. But I think he's also been pushing it really hard, getting ready for this stream. He's really been putting in a ton of work behind it, and he got really sick. So, and he had to make that tough call. I was about to hop on the road and drive down to Arizona, and he said, I think this is the right call to make. We're going to postpone it. But having said that, even though we've been promoting it a bunch, that's the correct decision to make, because we're going to circle back to this. We're definitely going to do it, and it's going to be even better probably than had we done it this weekend with some of the circumstances and the compromises we were going to have to make. So Wesley made the right call on there. I'm a little bummed also because I just wanted to visit with Wesley and hang out at his shop and do this show from there. So if you've been looking forward to that, hang tight. It's gonna be coming. It's gonna be coming. And send Wesley, if you're a subscriber on his channel, send him some ideas, some thoughts on what you would do with this Bentley, and maybe we'll have some extra time to incorporate that into the project. So now, before we get to my guest, Joe Ligo, and I really got to thank Joe for coming on, too, because he was willing to come on last minute, because I said, well, we were going to do this cool live stream with Wesley, and I can't just come on the show and just do a regular show. I mean, I can't come off of that and just do a normal show. So Joe said he would be willing to come on last minute and be a guest. So I think this is a real treat. This is going to be really exciting. Can't wait to talk to Joe. He's again coming up here in the next segment. But before we get to that, I saw a piece of automotive news that I am really, I think, I won't say surprised. This is something that makes me say, I think I was right all along. Yes, me admitting that I was right all along. That's a shocker, isn't it? Can you believe I said no? But this comes by way of Autocar, a publication out of the UK, and they run this headline, and they say, Mercedes to bring back cabin buttons for current and future models. Mercedes is bringing back buttons to their lineup, and this is going to start with the new GLC and CLA shooting brake EVs. Now, this is interesting because Mercedes has just put what they are calling, by the way, the largest touchscreen ever in a car. And that I find is interesting. They put a lot of this effort into this touchscreen, which they call the MBUX Hyperscreen. Is it MBUX? Is that how you pronounce that? I don't know. It's German. But they call it the Hyperscreen, and it's a 39.1-inch touchscreen that spans the entire width of the dashboard in the new GLC. Okay, so it's a gigantic touchscreen. Sure, it looks cool. I will admit, it looks impressive. It looks very futuristic. It looks very, very, I don't know, like Star Trek. You know, maybe like Star Trek: The Next Generation. We're not talking original series here, but it's like a giant touchscreen that goes across, right? And I think, yes, it looks cool. Now, do I want to know what that touchscreen is going to cost to replace out of warranty when it fails? No, I don't want to know. I don't want to be anywhere near that thing when that fails. However, they put all this R&D into that, and they're coming around now and saying that in their studies, their research, that they've discovered that consumers were saying they didn't like the giant touchscreens. They wanted real buttons. Gee, we've only been saying that on this show for years at this point. Years and years. We have been staunch advocates for physical buttons in cars. And it's not that I'm anti-screen altogether, though. I mean, actually, I kind of am. I do like cars that have a screen for the gauge cluster, and it's really, and especially if it's configurable, because you're able to have your speedometer here, maybe your tachometer here, but importantly, you can have a map take up that whole gauge cluster screen if you want. And that's great. You're driving around and you just glance down at the gauge cluster to see your map, your directions, all of that. I think that's a really smart use of that space. But having these giant screens, these tablets in the center stack, they ruin the interior lines and design of the car, first and foremost. It's very hard for those not to look like a giant tablet, because that's what they are. And then it also creates a number of issues because it compels manufacturers. Okay, we got this screen in here, and I've talked about the reasons for this and the manufacturing reasons, and why, even though it's an expensive screen to put in, manufacturers are probably adding up all the little costs of the buttons and the switches and the production on it. There's a lot that actually goes into this, right? And they put the screen in there, and then they say, okay, we got to do all the HVAC controls in there too. We got to do all of the vehicle functions in there too. And you're driving around, you're on a bouncy road, bumpy road, you're bouncing around, and your fingers hopping around on the screen. It's a pain, right? And I think people, as a whole, don't like them. Yet people buy them because people want to look like they have the cool tech, that they have the newest, the latest and greatest, even when the latest and greatest isn't really all that good. And it's an interesting pivot for Mercedes to do this. It's a very interesting pivot And now they're saying that, let's see here. Mercedes said, a spokesman said, quote, "You can see a difference if you move from the CLA, which has the touchscreen and fewer hard buttons, to the new GLC, where we put back the rollers and buttons because we see in the data that the rollers and these physical buttons are very important for certain age groups and certain populations." So they're making it sound all corporate-y. Oh, we've done our research, and this is what we believe is correct. No, that's just them admitting that they're wrong. That's what it is. That's corporate speak for, yeah, sorry, guys, we got it wrong. We'll give you your buttons back. So this is a good pivot. If Mercedes is doing it, I'd like to see other manufacturers do it and adopt it more. When I look at the comments on the YouTube video version of this show, I see a lot of people who don't like the buttons. I mean, looking at some comments right now, Jake RH7YY, he says, quote, "Screens suck. Get a damn map." Oh, man. You can, yeah, Mercedes, good call here. You shouldn't have done it in the first place. But anyway, coming up after the break, Joe Ligo, we're talking AMC right here.
He can't drive 55. Not when his car is still on jack stands. This is Automotive ADHD with Matt West.
In my defense, that car that was on jack stands, if you're watching on video, YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, and more, it's not there anymore. I'm just saying, we did get it. I won't say running, but it did move. So take that, station voice guy. Of course, you're listening to the Automotive ADHD show. I'm your host, Matt West. And before we get to my next guest, I have a very special guest lined up here for you. We're going to talk about American Motors, the history of American Motors, and a fantastic documentary series that my guest really, put some amazing work into creating and bringing to the masses. This is really cool. So we're going to get to that. Before we do, though, I want to thank our sponsor, SpyTech, for providing some amazing GPS trackers. If you're like me, a lot of us, you either have had a car stolen in your life or someone you know has. And SpyTech provides these fantastic GPS trackers that use GPS signal and cell signal together. They're a lot better than just throwing an Apple AirTag in your car. That's a terrible idea, by the way, just to put an AirTag in your car. And these guys really make some great trackers, and they're wanting to give you a discount to protect your car, whether you've got a classic car, whether it's your daily driver, whether you're like me and you got a few cars and maybe you want to have a tracker on your trailer too, just for good measure. You can get 15% off everything in the SpyTech store, which is, by the way, spytech.com, and that's tech spelled TEC. And you can get 15% off everything in the store with my code AutoADHD15, as well as a 35% discount on an annual subscription for those GPS trackers. So get your stuff protected. You never want to be in that situation where your car's suddenly not in the driveway one morning and you go, what do we do now? Where do we even start looking? SpyTech wants to help you with that. Check them out, spytech.com. Again, that code is AutoADHD15. Now, I want to invite my guest onto the show, Joe Ligo. Joe is a Emmy award-winning TV producer. He's worked on a number of projects you probably recognize, including Motor Week, by the way. A lot of us grew up watching Motor Week, and Joe is a part of that. And now he's got his own venture talking about AMC, the Last Independent Automaker. Joe Ligo, welcome to Automotive ADHD.
Thanks for having me, man.
Glad to have you. And I should clarify, welcome you back, because I'm glad to have you back on. I think it was about 2 years ago that you were on my show and you were talking about the production of this documentary series. And I thought that this was really cool. This was really special. And you've done this deep dive into the history of AMC. And I think, us car guys, you talk about AMC, you talk about American Motors, and a lot of us, understand that. We recognize that someone's got some history with AMC. But nowadays, I think a lot of people, especially those of us who aren't, bit by the automotive bug, for better or for worse on that too, by the way. That's a very expensive bug to get bit by. But, a lot of people aren't familiar with AMC. And I want to kind of get into that history. But before we do that, Joe, just give me a little bit of your background, because you've got a long history in television production. And I think that's very cool. Give me a little bit of that backstory.
Sure. So, I went to school for TV and broadcasting. I always found it interesting, making silly home movies with my friends and that kind of thing. And a year out of college, I had the chance to go work for the TV show Motor Week, which, combined my love of television and cars. And so I worked there for 3.5 years, somewhere in there. I had a really great time, learned a lot about automotive media and the production side of things. Took some detours through other jobs and opportunities. I produced a show about agriculture, having grown up on a farm. I guess you could say that was another area of my life I was excited about. And so I produced a show about farming. That was really fun. Of course, all of my stories, I was like, how can we do stories about tractors, combines, machines,
Yeah.
Our team had a nice division that they let me do all the machine stories and they would do all the animal stories. So, it's like, oh, baby goats, baby animals. You guys do that. I'm going to go test drive a combine or whatever. But anyways, so that was a really fun thing. But yes, I had way back in 2016-ish had this idea of wanting to do a documentary on the history of American motors. I had met some interesting people through the AMC clubs. And, I was passionate about these vehicles, even though at the time I didn't own one yet. But I realized that this story was going to be lost to time. A lot of these guys and guys and girls who used to work for American Motors weren't going to be around forever. People were forgetting the history of this company.
Mm-hmm.
And so some friends and I got together and we started, we didn't really have a great plan when we started. We just wanted to get interviews. We said, we'll make this into a documentary someday, somehow. And eventually the project grew so big that I had to quit my full-time job to finish it. I was like, there's just too much here, too much to do. It's too big. We have to finish this. We can't just put these interviews on a shelf and abandon them. We have to see this thing through to the end. And so I was kind of the leader of our little 3-man team in doing that. And we shot the interviews. I put together a script and worked with my co-producer on the script. And then I worked with the other co-producer on the editing. We filmed the car footage to go with it. And then finally, in the spring of 2025, the series debuted. It was distributed through public television. So it's available on PBS stations around the country. Each station chooses individually when they want to air it. So, check your local listings if you want to see it on TV. It's also available on the free PBS app, and it's on YouTube. If you go to our YouTube channel, Auto Moments on YouTube, we have the full series there. So it ended up being 6 half hours. So it's 3 hours. So it's a bingeable experience. But I figure, if you have a half-hour lunch break, you can finish the thing in a week. If you're that patient, you might just want to finish it in an afternoon if you have the time.
I think if you start watching this, you will want to finish it in one sitting, because it's really well done. The production is excellent. The storytelling is excellent. And it goes with this fascinating American story about an American car company. And really, you got to check this documentary out. Now, I mean, you say you've got, what you said, 6 30-minute episodes of the miniseries, but
right.
When you put that, we'll talk about this a little bit more maybe in the next segment, but that means that's a 3-hour production, which is longer than your average feature film. I mean, that's no small feat when it comes to putting together a documentary. I mean, really, that's, this really must have been a labor of love in many ways to put this together.
Yes, absolutely. It was a lot of work. Our team put a lot of, we put a lot of unpaid hours into getting this to be as good as we just couldn't. And this went for all three of us. This isn't just me, but my co-producers, Jim Needle and Pat Foster, none of us could be okay if it was bad. We had to make it good. We had to make it as good as possible, even if that meant taking extra time, and things taking longer and more work and spending more money to shoot the footage we needed. But none of us could let it be bad. We wanted it to be as good as possible. And so, and there was a moment in 2023 when I finished the first rough cut of the script, and we knew that, like, okay, this is going to be 3 hours long or something. And I looked, and the script was way too long. I had to cut it down, but it was 38,000 words. I looked it up. I was like, this is like longer than some novels. Like, this is I've written basically a novel here, and then had to cut that down to be, more manageable. And eventually, yeah, that's how we got the 6.5 hours that we have. But yeah, it really is crazy. And somebody else who was, kind of a film expert or an independent film person, they said, when you do a fictional movie, a lot of the hard work is done on the front end, and then you have the script, you have the actors, you shoot it, and then the editing is like, okay, everything goes together pretty quickly. But he said with documentary, it's the opposite. You get to go out and shoot stuff, and it's easy because you don't have to deal with actors and a big stage and props and sets. But he said, but on the back end, the editing is really hard because you have to sort through all the material you collected. And I wish I had thought of that when I started, because that was certainly the hardest part for us, was the editing. It took a very long time to put it all together.
I imagine so. And I mean, people are just used to watching a documentary and saying, oh yeah, that was really cool, that was fun and insightful, but they're not always aware of some of that, really the work that does go into that. And you're right. That's one of those things that you can plan it as much as you want on the front end, but in many ways you're crafting that story after the fact. You're saying, we got all of this stuff, we got these interviews, this ties into this, you got this big spider web of stuff, and then in the edit, it's your job to bring that into a single cohesive storyline.
Right. Make it make sense.
Well, and I think this is really fascinating, and we're going to get more into, I'm just curious, for one, about the production of it, but I want to get into as well some of the stories and the history of American motors, because I mean, people have had, a lot of people have had experience with American Motors cars in one way or another. And even if you go, well, I don't know if I've ever been around one. I don't know. Did you watch Wayne's World? I'm just saying, there's a lot of places where AMC cars actually turned up, and people didn't necessarily realize it. People more in my age demographic at this point, obviously a lot of folks who are older purchase these cars. They enjoy them. They've kept them on the road. Like you said, you talk to various owners groups and clubs getting into this. And I think some of the AMC people who really love these cars are like a special breed of car people, because just like AMC as a company,
Absolutely.
they're a little different with how they do stuff.
Yeah, I'm very grateful. Yeah, there's so many people I should thank for, helping us make this. It certainly was a group effort. We were so blessed to have so many people who gave of their time and talents, their cars, their expertise, their photographs, their interviews, whatever. But yes, the AMC community is a really great community. It has the same kind of underdog spirit that American Motors had. It's this feeling that we're all in this together, kind of fighting I wouldn't say it's a fight, but I'd say it's, they're fighting for their respect, as a hobby. Because I think for years and years and years, people kind of looked down on AMC cars. And I think now we're kind of having a moment. I think, and that's not due to anything I did. I think that was happening before I came along, was that, in the 2010s, I think people were finally starting to realize, like, hey, these cars are pretty special and they're a little different. And if you have an AMX or a Javelin or even a Gremlin or a Pacer, and you take it to your local cruise-in, you might be the only one there. And there might be dozens of Mustangs and Corvettes, but you might be the only AMC. And I think people started to appreciate what made AMCs unique. And so I just tapped into that. I can't take any credit for that, but I think we tapped into a moment where people are realizing that these cars are pretty cool. And I think the prices on the collector market reflect that. I mean, if you look at price history, it's a shame because AMC guys are like, for years, like, man, our cars get no respect. And now they're like, oh man, all the cars are too expensive. You can't buy them anymore. So I don't know what you want, but I think if you look at the numbers on the collector market, yeah, AMCs are having a moment, which is really cool.
Absolutely. Joe Ligo, my guest, documentary filmmaker. And Joe, we're going to get to all of this, and I want to touch on some of the actual history of AMC now. We've given people a little bit of a taste of it. Let's go do a deep dive into it. We're going to get into more of that on the other side of this break. You're listening to Automotive ADHD. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
This year, 9 million of you Americans will buy a car, probably from one of the 3 big car companies, without even considering American Motors. Now, that's a shame. Last April, we came out with a Gremlin, an American car that met the economy imports head on. Nobody had ever done that before. We went all out designing the Javelin, even at the risk of scaring some people off. And nobody's ever done that before. This fall, the Sportabout, a stylish compact car designed for the way a woman uses a car. Nobody else is doing that. On every Ambassador model, we're making air conditioning and automatic transmission standard. And nobody else does that. Why is American Motors doing all this? If you had to compete with the three biggest car companies in America, what would you do?
Oh man, I love that. By the way, Joe Ligo, my guest.
Classic.
You're listening to Automotive ADHD, heard around the state of Colorado on the radio. Several great radio stations to catch it on. Of course, we're here out of my flagship station, AM 1460, The Answer. But you can also catch this online, video, podcast, wherever fine shows and mine are downloaded. And Joe, that ad there, that's from 1970, and I love when he says. You know, he says, why is American Motors doing this? Well, what would you do if you had to compete with the big three automakers, right? And that, yep. I think that really embodies the history in a way. Like, that encompasses the fact that AMC's always been this underdog, but they did interesting and exciting things because, well, the big three aren't doing it this way. Who else is going to do it? Is that right? Does that really sum it up?
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at American Motors Corporation, you look at their history, the times when they did best was when they tried to do things that the big three weren't doing. If you look at their most successful products, it's when they found a slice of the market where they could go that there was less competition and they could kind of specialize. And so the two biggest examples of that would be in the 1950s, they convinced America to try out the compact car. The idea that you didn't need, a 20-foot, as the CEO, George Romney, said, you didn't need, a dinosaur gas guzzler to go to the grocery store. And so that was their first big innovation was winning people over on compact cars before the VW Beetle was, even popular in the United States. People were buying Ramblers. And then the second thing was that with their acquisition of the Jeep brand in 1969 from Kaiser Industries, they exploded the four-wheel drive market in the United States and really saw the potential that Jeeps had to become everyday vehicles, that people would drive SUVs every day and they weren't just for farmers and hardcore outdoorsmen, but they were for regular folks. And so I think those are their two biggest ways that they really revolutionized the American automotive market. And yeah, and it was because they were doing things differently, just like that ad says, which is a great advertisement, that 1970 ad with that's actually Kevin McCarthy, the actor in that ad. And Weird Al fans will recognize him as the villain from the movie UHF. If you that's a real deep cut.
There you go.
He's the bad guy from the movie UHF. The commercial itself is a parody of the movie Patton, which came out around that time and has General George Patton standing in front of a giant American flag. And so that's why they have Kevin McCarthy standing in front of a giant AMC logo wearing that kind of military uniform. So that's a very fun kind of pop culture connection there with that advertisement. It's a great ad, especially because it shows their full lineup, which is always way more fun than just a single model.
Right. Hey, you're not getting this on other car shows, by the way. So, now, and it's interesting too, because that ad has, yes, it's in a sense a parody, but it also has this sort of patriotic feel to it that, the company is called American Motors. It isn't Ford. It isn't Dodge. It isn't General Motors. And those are all American companies, sure. But I mean, you have to, if you're American Motors in this sense too, you have to play into this sense of national pride a little bit as well as Americans, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, they did that throughout their advertising, especially during the muscle car era. They had special red, white, and blue packages and, different muscle cars and that kind of thing. And you saw it show up in their advertising from time to time. The name American Motors, and this gets to your kind of question of just a little bit of backstory of the company. The name American Motors Corporation, which was actually the idea of George Mason, who was president of the Nash Kelvinator Corporation. And so American Motors was created by the merger of the Nash Kelvinator Corporation, which made cars, and the Hudson Motor Car Company, which made like the Hudson Hornet. And his idea was for these two companies to merge, and he would call it American Motors rather than calling it Nash-Hudson or Hudson-Nash or the Nash and Hudson car, whatever. He said, no, we're going to rename the whole company. We're going to call it American Motors Corporation. And so that was kind of his genius. They didn't focus group it. They didn't, do test, market evaluate. That was just his idea. And I think it was a great name.
Absolutely. And they made some very interesting cars, and we touched on that as well. How you have to be a little bit different. You have to do these different things. Like you said, with the import cars, getting people to try not import cars. You can see where my brain's going on this already. A little bit of a slip there on compact cars. And they did that before really the import craze happened. Like you said, before Volkswagen with with the Beetle, with, some of the other cars that they brought across, but also with the Japanese, especially, who brought compact cars to the American market. American Motors said, if you want a compact car, here's an American compact car.
Right. And it was this idea that, and we talk about this in the first episode. The first episode talks about the events leading up to the merger of Nash and Hudson, which creates American Motors in 1954. And for the first few years after the merger, American Motors really struggled to get its footing. It was still building large cars. It was still kind of competing price-wise with Buick, Oldsmobile, high-end Dodge, low-end Chrysler, Mercury, that kind of what they would call the mid-price field. Mm-hmm. And they were struggling to compete because just in terms of volume, they just couldn't compete with the big three. And so, the president, George Romney, who was the father of Mitt Romney, who we actually interviewed for the series, George Romney had this idea of, well, let's go all in on the compact car. We'll build the one thing that the big three aren't building, which is a small car. And the Rambler, that was the name of the compact, hit this sweet spot of being bigger than an imported European car, bigger than a VW Beetle or a Fiat or a Morris Minor, whatever British cars were being imported to the US at the time. But smaller than, a full-size Ford or Chevy. Mm-hmm. And so it was really this kind of in-betweener, which was great for Americans who wanted to step down from a full-size car, but they weren't ready to drive a Fiat, And so that kind of hit the sweet spot for a lot of buyers and kind of opened up this whole new segment. And, by 1959, American Motors had turned around and was making tons of money off their cars. Sales were up. And by 1960, the big three were in that market with the Valiant and the Ford Falcon and the Chevrolet Corvair, and then later the Chevy too. So it didn't take long for the big three to see the wisdom of AMC's moves there. But it's a very interesting history. And you're right. The whole idea was that this car struck a niche that wasn't being met, an in-betweener for people who wanted something that was a little smaller, but not too small.
Well, and if I'm correct, too, they really were able to target younger buyers with that, too, especially, really engaging that younger audience who was buying, their first family car, for example, and they didn't want something gigantic.
Right, exactly. And, American Motors, we talk about this in episode 2, they kind of lost their way in the 60s. They got a new CEO, and his whole thing was he wanted big cars, luxury cars, big again. And so they kind of lost some of their leadership in that compact market. And it's funny, you watch, in 1961 or whatever, VW Beetle sales are, 40,000, 50,000. And, by the end of the 60s, Beetle sales are like 500, 600,000 units. And the Beetle goes from being a nobody car to outselling AMC's entire lineup. Mm-hmm. Not just outselling one of their models, outselling their entire lineup. And so, the 60s really kind of got brutal.
Right.
And in the 70s,
Joe Ligo, my guest. Joe, hold that thought for just a second. We got to take a commercial break right here, but you're listening to the Automotive ADHD show. We're going to keep this going on the other side of the break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
This is Automotive ADHD with Matt West.
Oh, and not just me, but I have a special guest joining us, Joe Ligo. He is a documentary filmmaker. If you're just tuning in, he has produced this amazing mini-series, a documentary series about American Motors. And this series is airing on PBS, but it's also available online. And this is a This is a really cool series talking about an automaker that I think a lot of people have forgotten about at this point, but it's such a interesting history of an American company that, like you were saying, Joe, you didn't want the stories to be forgotten, the interviews, the people who worked there. You wanted to keep these stories alive.
Absolutely. Yes. We, before this project even had a name, before it was even called the Last Independent Automaker, we were out shooting interviews with people who used to work at American Motors because, I don't want to be morbid, but we were like, we need to capture these stories because nobody else is going to.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the people who we interviewed were so grateful that we were interested in their careers. People who worked, everything we interviewed, everything from folks who worked on the assembly line up to 2 former CEOs, designers, engineers, marketing, sales, whatever. And a lot of these people had never been interviewed before. And so, we were getting stories that they had never told, never shared. And so all of those make their way into, all 6 episodes, which are available now on YouTube, like you mentioned, on PBS. Just look for the Last Independent Automaker. And yeah, it's been really cool how it's kind of divides. We knew we were probably going to do episodes, but it's neat how each episode is kind of a different time period in history. And so it captures a moment of 5 to 10 years in each episode. And it's so fun that you kind of get to dive back into the late 60s or dive back into the mid 70s and really kind of immerse yourself in at least I did on the production side of it, immerse myself in the type of cars people were driving, the type of music people were listening to, what the country was going through. It's a fun thing. It was really cool how episode 1 is so different from episode 6 because the cars are so different and the people that we talked to were different and what they were doing and what the country was going through and what kind of cars people were buying. It was so different from those different eras. But the through line of American Motors is there through all 6 episodes.
Well, and it's interesting that you kind of mentioned as well the culture surrounding it. And I've talked about on this show in a lot of ways that cars are reflective of the culture at the time in so many ways.
I mean, we're going through.
Yeah, they are. They're reflective of the tastes. They're reflective of what's popular. They're reflective of politics at the time. There's so much. Cars are such a interesting. They're sort of like, it's a weird thing to compare it to, but you think about, tree rings, right? And the tree grows and you get a new ring every time. Well, cars obviously aren't trees, but you have these cars of different decades and they're still around and you're able to go explore these cars, through car shows, through car groups, through different things, actually interact with these machines and see something from a culture perhaps before your own lifetime. And there's something really cool about that. And I think you really document that well in the series in addition to that.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Yeah, and that was one thing we were excited about is we actually went out and filmed vehicles. We used a lot of historical material, old TV commercials, old advertisements, old print photographs and stuff. But we also knew we wanted to go out and film these cars. We couldn't film every AMC ever made, but we tried to get all the most important ones. And that doesn't always mean they're favorite ones. Like, everybody's favorite car, the Javelin, the AMX, the muscle cars. But like that also meant tracking down the AMCs that were like regular people cars, like a 4-door Rambler sedan, or one of the harder things to find was like an AMC Concorde, because that was just kind of a throwaway car you'd drive for 5 years and then sell as a used car, whatever. And people didn't save them. And so that was a cool part for me, was tracking down these vehicles, filming them so that we can see what did they look like, what did they sound like. We tried to find them in stock condition or restored to stock condition so that the viewer could see like, wow, this is really what people drove then. And so that was a really cool part of the process, was finding the cars and including them so that when a designer says, oh, well, we did this on this part of the car because of this goes that way, this piece of metal bends this way, then we can show a clip so that when somebody talks about the roof line on the AMC or the Rambler AMC Marlin, we can show a clip of that car and you can see exactly what that designer's talking about.
Yeah, and if you're passionately into cars, I mean, you're gonna geek out on this to like a whole new level, by the way. But also if you're, maybe casually into cars, or maybe maybe you're listening and you've got a buddy, a family member who owned one of these cars at one point, maybe back in the 70s, back in the 80s, This is, something that I think has a little bit of something for everyone. A trip down memory lane, of course, for a lot of people, but
absolutely.
But also a peek behind the curtain that you may not have seen, even if, say, you were alive at this time. Maybe you owned one of these cars when it was new. This is like a peek behind the curtain at this company that was just different than the big three, and they were doing their job to make that aware, to make you aware of that. Now, Joe Ligo, again, is my guest. We're talking about the Last Independent Automaker. And Joe, I want to ask you a question, which is, what makes an independent automaker? Why are they independent?
Sure.
Like, yes, they're different than GM and Ford, but
sure.
Wouldn't those be independent on their own as well? Why is AMC different?
So it's a journalistic term. And it's not 100% accurate, but this is where we've gotten a lot of questions about this title. If I were to do this again, maybe I'd give it a different title. But back in the 50 years ago, 80 years ago, when the press started talking about the car companies and the industry lingo was being developed, the term independent was created to describe a car company that wasn't part of the big three, because General Motors was a conglomerate of multiple brands that had merged together. And Chrysler Corporation was a conglomerate of multiple brands that had merged together. Technically, Ford did buy Lincoln, but Mercury was actually just created by Ford. But the idea was that an independent was a smaller company without a bunch of different brands. It was just one brand. So, for instance, the big three were conglomerates. Studebaker was an independent. Nash was an independent. Hudson was an independent. Kaiser Frazer was an independent. And then, of course, that term stuck as a descriptor. Technically, it's not accurate for American Motors, because American Motors was two companies that merged. It was two companies, so it's technically not an independent. But even with the merger of Hudson and Nash, American Motors was still so much smaller than even Chrysler. It was one of those things where GM had 60% of the market or something, and Ford had, or not quite that much, but GM, Ford, and Chrysler together controlled 85% of the market. And American Motors was maybe 5% on their best day. And so technically they're not independent because they're two companies that merged. But for linguistic purposes, the industry continued to refer to AMC. I mean, even well into the 70s, the industry continued to refer to AMC as an independent. Sometimes you would see journalists call them the big four, GM, Ford, Chrysler, and AMC. But most of the time, the term independent was used well into the 70s, until finally when the imports came along, then they just kind of said there was the big three and everyone else.
Right. Now, again,
that's a very long-winded answer to the question of why is it called the Last Independent Automaker. It's because AMC, of all the independents, was the one who survived the longest into the 1980s. And yes, you have technicalities like, oh, well, what about Bricklin? What about DeLorean? But those were all boutique automakers. And, then some people are like, well, what about Tesla? And I'm like, okay, fine. They're an independent automaker. But for the purpose of this story, we're talking about the independent as meaning a pre-World War II company that, competed against the big three.
Right. Now,
sorry for the...
No, that's perfect. That's why we have you on the show. I mean, the history and this knowledge is really incredible. And again, my guest is Joe Ligo. Joe, we've only got about 30 seconds. Can I keep you after the show for a podcast bonus? Would you be okay with that for a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. I can hang around.
Awesome. So, and real quick, and what's the best way? Because I got like a dozen other questions I want to ask you, and I realize we're out of time on the radio. Real quick, 20 seconds, what's the best way to catch this? How do people watch it?
Absolutely. To find out more about the program, go to lastindependentauto.com. We also have a Facebook page, just Facebook Last Independent Auto, or just Google The Last Independent Automaker. It's available everywhere.
Fantastic. You heard it right here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. My guest, Joe Ligo. You're right here on Automotive ADHD.